By definition, a storyteller conveys events in words, images, and sounds, often by improvisation or embellishment. The Living Bread Radio Network presents The Storytellers with Tony Agnesi. Today you'll hear a faith-based, inspirational story that's both heartfelt and heartwarming. And now, let's meet today's storyteller with Tony Agnesi.
This is Tony Agnesi, and welcome to another episode of The Storytellers. On the show today, we have Haley Stewart. She's written a book called The Grace of Enough, Pursuing Less and Living More. In a throwaway culture, we're going to be talking with Haley about her blog and about her writing and her speaking and how you might take some heed to what she says and kind of get off that throwaway culture train yourself. Haley, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
We talked a little bit just for a second there before we started. You know, there's that old saying about being one less rat in the rat race, and you did it.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Let's give us a little background. Let's go backwards here. Tell us a little bit about your faith experience and where you come from and how you and your husband decided to take this big step and get out of the everyday throwaway rat race and live a simpler life. Give us the stuff that leads up to that. I'm really interested in seeing how you came about to those ideas.
Yeah, so my husband Daniel and I were both raised in Protestant Christian families, and then in college were exposed to the writings of the early church fathers, and slowly all of our misconceptions about what the church actually taught about the history of the church kind of melted away the more that we learned. And I was personally very drawn to the traditions and beauty of the church, and my husband was more of a reluctant convert, but just felt like, well, now that we know all this, to whom can we go? This is the direction we're heading in. And then after our first child was born, we realized, well, we've got to get him baptized, so we've got to start RCIA. Mm-hmm. And that kind of pushed us across the Tiber. So we were in our late 20s with 3 little ones in Tallahassee, Florida, and we were homeowners. My husband was working a regular 9-to-5 grind that he was not enjoying, having to work a lot of hours, didn't have a lot of time as a family, and we just felt like our life was very rushed. We weren't seeing each other very much, and yet we were still kind of in this race to acquire more. It still felt like we didn't have enough, not enough money, just not enough. And so we were feeling very stuck and wanted to really do a complete reboot of the way our work and family life looked. And so we thought, wow, it would be great to buy a farm and start living on a farm, have time together, all these things. But we realized we can't afford to buy a farm if we don't know anything about farming. So we would just be setting ourselves up for failure if we did that. So instead, we kind of spent some time discerning, praying, trying to figure out how we could achieve what we wanted to achieve. And we decided to apply for a year-long internship at a sustainable agriculture training farm in Waco, Texas. And so we sold our house and got rid of more than half of our stuff to move into a teeny tiny little apartment on this farm with no flushing toilets. And we spent a year kind of reacquainting ourselves with each other and what we wanted our family life to look like and how we wanted to try to pursue the gospel in the midst of modern life. Mm-hmm.
Now, where are the kids in all of this?
Yeah, at the time that we moved, they were 5, 3, and 2. And since then, we've had another little one. And they were very excited about moving to a farm, but they were upset about leaving extended family in Florida. That was hard, and I think that was hard for everybody. But they loved living on a farm, and it was interesting to see how we were living in half the square footage of our house in Florida. We got rid of almost all of their stuff, and they didn't seem to notice any of that. What they noticed was that we got to have 3 meals a day together, and we got to be on this farm and visit animals and do all of these things. And so that was what they noticed, which was interesting. It was all relational. They noticed having to leave relationships in Florida, and then they noticed all this relational stuff on the farm.
We live in a society, Haley, that kind of pushes us the opposite direction. You know, more is more. If you have 1 car, you need 2. If you have a 3-bedroom house, you need a 4. If you if you have the hamburger, you need the quarter pounder. If you need the quarter pounder, you need the double quarter pounder. We kind of push everyone towards more. And how do you just come to the conclusion to say stop with all of this?
Yeah, I think it requires really acknowledging that having more stuff is not satisfying to us, and that there will never be enough. You know, no matter how much money we have, no matter how big our house is, how nice our cars are, it's never going to be enough, and we'll always feel like we need more. And so I think to acknowledge that our stuff can never satisfy us because we were designed to only be satisfied with something much greater, following Christ, and that only God can really fill up those places in our heart, even though we try to fill them up with stuff. And so I think that's the first step, is acknowledging that those things can't satisfy, and then discerning as a family, okay, well, how much does our family really need? What would actually be just enough? Because I think that varies according to circumstance and according to families, which is why there's no Vatican-issued
sure.
list of, this is what you get to have. And so I think that it's a process of prayer and discernment.
I'm married to, I call her Mrs. Clean. She's an interior decorator by profession, and if I'm reading a magazine and I get up to get a drink of water, it could well be gone. She is I don't want to say a minimalist, but certainly she doesn't like a lot of stuff that kind of clutters and so forth. And we have kind of a rule: if I bring in something the size of a bread box, I have to get rid of something about that same size. So minimalism and those types of things tend to be generally associated with Zen or with Buddhist thinking. How do we use Christianity and our Catholicism to help guide us in this sense of living with less?
Yeah, well, I think that what we have to focus on is going back to the source, that all of this is trying to orient our lives towards Christ and towards holiness. And so the secular world understands that if we have homes that aren't as full of clutter, that makes us feel better. We don't feel distracted. We're not, we can relax. This is good for our brains, and it's good for us not to be surrounded with so much stuff. But then if we don't have Christ as the center of that, it can become just as much of an idol as acquisition. Someone living in one of the tiny houses might be just as obsessed with their possessions, even though they have fewer of them, as someone in a big mansion. So I think it's key to realize that the whole point is following Christ and not being as distracted by our stuff. And sometimes that might require having a little bit more. Like I've been asked the question a lot lately as Christmas is coming. What do we do if we have grandparents who want to get lots of gifts for the kids? If we don't want, we're trying to live a more minimalist life. We don't want to have all of this stuff. And sometimes, what might be a better option than hurting a relationship by offending family members who just want to be generous is by accepting a little more stuff. Because the point is Christ and showing love to others and pursuing holiness. And so sometimes it might require accepting more things into your home. So I think what's key is that it always needs to be oriented towards pursuing the gospel and following Christ. And if it is, then we'll be moving in the right direction.
I know you at one time you did a project coordinating at Baylor University. And I know you're a dancer and so forth. How did you begin to write? Were you always a writer? Is it something that you've done in the past, or did the writing kind of come as a result of this lifestyle change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually had just been reflecting on that and wrote up something on my blog about that, because I really enjoyed academic life, but I never loved writing. I never considered myself to be a writer at all. And then my son was born, our first child was born right the year after I graduated from college. And it was like suddenly I had this burst of creativity, and I started writing reflections, and a year and a half later I started writing a blog. And it was like motherhood. I think a lot of times in our culture we hear about how motherhood kind of squelches your creativity and you don't get to do anything anymore. And in my case, I felt like I was able to discover for the first time parts of myself that I had never known about after becoming a mother. It just kind of, the floodgates opened with my creative life. And so that was really when I started writing. I started blogging and writing a little bit about our conversion, and just kept going from there, and just eventually really started to enjoy it as a creative outlet.
Now, the blogging, I started my writing by blogging as well. And what kind of, the stories you wrote, what kind of feedback did you get from the blog? What kind of things came back to you when you would put something out there?
Yeah, well, when I started writing, I guess it was 2009, 2010, and blogging was a little bit different then, because you didn't have as many conversations on social media. It was all in the comment box on your blog. Mm-hmm. And so it was really neat to make connections, mostly with other women kind of my age who were maybe in young motherhood and kind of trying to figure out this season of life that they're in. And so I really discovered this whole community of young Catholic women that I got to connect with through having a blog. And, some of them are very, very close friends that I see in real life frequently. So it's interesting how that can be just a blog can be a catalyst for community.
Mm-hmm. And did the books, your first book that you wrote, Feast, Real Food, Reflections, and Simple Living, did the books come out of the blog, or did the blog prompt you to begin writing in longer form?
Yeah, well, we started on the blog. We were first kind of documenting our observation of the liturgical year, because as converts, that was all completely new to us. Mm-hmm. And so we did some of the documenting of that on the blog, and that became something that people really enjoyed. And so we tried to expand that, do recipes. My husband is a fabulous cook. I'm just his sous chef. And so we'd put together recipes and write about the liturgical year and put it all in one place for people. So it kind of grew out of the blog.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My guest is Haley Stewart. The book is The Grace of Enough. That's her latest. And when we return, we're going to talk a little bit about her life and what her family discovered during this idea of becoming an intentional Christian and living with less. When we return on The Storytellers.
CatholicBook.net is your source for all things Catholic. With a large selection of unique items, we are here to serve the Lord by serving you. Visit our local shop in Canton at St. Raphael Books and Gifts, 4365 Fulton Drive Northwest. We are your source for all things Catholic. CatholicBook.net. For 30 years, a commitment to service.
Welcome back to The Storytellers. This is Tony Agnesi. Haley Stewart is my guest. She's a Catholic author, a podcaster, and speaker. And we're talking to her about her latest book, The Grace of Enough, Pursuing Less and Living More in a Throwaway Culture. Haley, talk to me a little bit about this throwaway culture. What was it that stood out for you and your husband about this throwaway culture, and why you wanted to kind of step away from it?
Right. Well, Pope Francis talks about we live in a throwaway culture, and he refers not, I think a lot of us think throwaway culture, consumerism, wastefulness, which is absolutely part of it. But he talks about how this throwaway attitude still becomes part of the way that we view the world around us, that it doesn't just affect possessions or even the resources of the earth, God's creation, but it affects how we view other human beings, that they're objects for our consumption. And so I think that was the most disturbing thing to us about realizing that we'd adopted kind of this throwaway mindset just through osmosis. It's around us all. It's something we constantly have to be noticing is in our heads and trying to reorient ourselves about. And so I think that there's this desire for more and desire for affluence and desire to consume that is never satisfied. And so I think in order to counteract that, we have to be incredibly intentional because everything is moving in that direction. And so to move in the opposite direction and really try to pursue the gospel and live a life we think is going to be truly satisfying, then we have to really go against the grain. And that requires a lot of intentionality, which is partly why we felt like we needed a year on a farm in order to do it.
Mm-hmm. And this idea of a throwaway culture, when you say it not just plastic bottles or paper bags, we throw away people as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's in ways both large and small. We can think of it, grave matters like euthanasia or abortion, where we're throwing away people, literally. But then even in other ways, things like our attentiveness to other people. Pope Francis talks about how parents really need to waste time with their children, which is a phrase that I really like because culturally we're so obsessed with our time and being productive and being efficient, and we kind of lose sight of all these things that are eternally valuable. And so the idea that we need to be attentive and be willing to waste time with the people God puts in our life as a way of honoring them and seeing their eternal value is something that really takes practice for us, for all of us.
The most important thing we can give someone is our time, right? There have been a lot of studies done about the difference between quality time and quantity time, and everybody assumes, well, I spend quality time, but what kids really want is quantity of time. Those things that happen not at the zoo or at the amusement park, but those things that happen in everyday life, sitting around watching a movie or having dinner at the dinner table and so forth. Those are the things that tend to be more memorable. Just the, as you say, wasting time together, and that seems to be something we've lost in our culture.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and it's those kind of normal, ordinary moments that it seems that my kids, at least, are always asking questions and starting conversations and all these ideas about their faith and all these questions that they have pop up in just these ordinary moments.
Mm-hmm. With my children and my wife and I, with our kids, sitting down to a meal together at dinner time was something we did every night. There was nothing that could come in the way of that and doing that, and so that's how my sons were raised. And my daughter-in-law, one of the things that attracted her to my son is that idea of togetherness and family and spending time together and just talking about things, as opposed to I'm off to my room with my dinner doing something and you're somewhere else, and we're just kind of disjointed of coming together as a family and sharing food and culture and what our experiences were that day around the family table. Talk a little bit about that, because I know that's part of what you talk about as well.
Sure. there's a quote by Wendell Berry that I put in the book, and I'm probably going to butcher it now, but it's something to the effect of, our kitchens have become like filling stations and our homes have become like hotels.
Mm-hmm.
And that's such a sad description, but I'm sure all of us in seasons of life that are very busy, we felt like we're rushing around, have felt like our house is just a hotel where we get to go there and sleep and then we rush off the next day. But to have that be your life in every season is something that's very new to modern life and not good for family life, to be rushing from thing to thing, to be just grabbing a bite to eat but not eating together, not having the time to stop, prepare a meal together, sit down, look at each other in the eye, have conversations, enjoy food together, do the dishes, all of those things. It's nothing revolutionary. It's incredibly simple, and it almost seems silly to say, sit down at a table and eat dinner together. It seems so simple, but it really is something that we've lost. And I think I'm kind of the millennial generation. I guess I'm an older millennial. I think my generation has really yearned for that and is trying to bring that back.
The technology world has changed things to the extent that some people, their smartphone seems to be an extension of their hand, and they sleep with it under their pillow in case somebody texts them at 4 a.m. I guess. You see these pictures online if you go on any social media sites of 8 people sitting around the table, and instead of looking at each other, they're all looking at their smartphone. How do we become more intentional about our use of the technology? Wonderful technology is wonderful, but how do we become more intentional about how we use it and what is enough?
That's such a good question, and I think it's a struggle for, me included, so many people, me included, and it's interesting. It's interesting to watch my kids, because we don't have a lot of technological gadgets in the home, but we have like one iPad that they share. And if we would allow it, that's what they would do 24 hours a day. It's like their brains are just wired to be addicted to that. Mm-hmm. And so watching them, it makes me more aware of my use of technology. And I think for a lot of us, me included, we have to really be tough on ourselves and intentional, because it's so easy to just have that habit where we're constantly reaching for our phone and scrolling and going through the same apps. I realized I was spending too much time on my phone this fall, and I just had to delete certain social media apps from my phone just so it wasn't even an option. Mm-hmm. Because I wasn't able to have a lot of self-control. And so I think really taking stock of how much time we're spending. You can actually download an app that tells you how many minutes a day you've been on your phone and how many times you picked it up, which if you do it, it will be a little bit terrifying the first
it is.
time you see.
I've done that, and it is terrifying. It is when you look at the amount of time you spend. It is terrifying when you see it.
And to think that sometimes I'm like, well, I just didn't have enough time today to pray. But I look at how much time I spent on my phone. It's like, oh, no, I did. I did have time to pray. I just did not use my time wisely. And so I think for most of us, because it is so easy to get addicted, we really have to be tough on ourselves by removing some of those temptations. Because personally, I don't have the self-control with some apps. I have to remove them, or else I'm going to be constantly checking them. And so I think, putting your phone in a different room to charge and go about your business, try to do things that don't require screens. I've realized that it's not helpful for me to use prayer apps. I really need a prayer book so I can put my phone in a different room and be attentive to that only. So I think it requires some tough love for ourselves to really get a handle on that, because it's a struggle.
It really is. You talk a little bit about prioritizing beauty as well, and again, this throwaway culture. I mean, if you don't have at least 40 products that you use in the morning before it's hard to go to work, you have to have all of these things. How do you come to terms with what do you really need and what is just somebody in the cosmetic industry trying to make a buck?
Oh, yeah. Well, my husband has some conspiracy theories that most cosmetic things just make things worse and make you have to buy more of them.
I probably would agree with him, yes.
So, like, for instance, your shampoo, like, strips all the oils from your hair, and then you have to put conditioner on so your hair's not frizzy, and you're just buying all of these things.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that requires personal discernment, again, figuring out, what do I really need? Those people need different things, and figuring out what is a necessity and what's just a want here. When we were getting rid of stuff for our move, knowing we were going to move into 650 square feet with 3 kids, each item that I picked up to decide if we were going to pack it or not, I just thought, is this thing really worth the space it's taking up to move it to this other place? And more than half the time, it just wasn't. And I realized how many things, we lived in that house in Florida for 5 years, and I realized how many things we had actually never used since our move to the house. In those 5 years, we had never used them. And they were just taking up space in our home and taking up mental space. And, you have to organize things, you have to maintain things, and just getting rid of so many things made us realize we don't need much. We also realized we took a little road trip between my husband's last day of work in Florida. We had 7 weeks before we had to be at the farm in Texas. And so we took a 7-week road trip with 3 kids under the age of 6, which was a little crazy. But we just had what was in our minivan.
Mm-hmm. And be able to do it with less, huh? And
it was amazing just how little we really needed to survive for those 7 weeks, even with 3 little kids. So by the time we got to the farm and our boxes were there, it felt like, oh, look at all this stuff, even though it was half of what we had before.
Well, Haley, this has been a very quick half hour here. I really appreciate it. Got a lot of great information from you. The book is available at catholicbook.net. It's also available all the other places you would find great books, and it's called The Grace of Enough, Pursuing Less and Living More in a Throwaway Culture. And that book is by our guest, Haley Stewart, and the foreword is written by our old buddy, Brandon Vaught. So, Haley, thank you so much for being with you. God bless you. It's great to have you with us, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
This is Tony Agnesi. We'll see you again next time on The Storytellers.
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Storytellers with Tony Agnesi, a production of the Living Bread Radio Network in Canton, Ohio. To learn more about today's storyteller, go to thestorytellersradio.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast and hear all of our past shows. And join us again next week at this same time for The Storytellers with Tony Agnesi.